I'm going to ask you all if you're okay with that. Okay, wonderful, wonderful. And we have a few people coming in. So people will be coming in as we speak. We're at the top of the hour, so we have an hour set aside for today. And of course, I want to make sure that I want to respect everyone's time. And of course, we do have a lot to get through. So welcome everyone to today. Let me just make sure I can share my screen okay. This is where I'm multitasking, and as you know, men particularly, and I'm a sort of gender specific here, are terrible at multitasking. Okay, so do bear with me with this because I want to make sure that I can share the screen and that everyone can see that. Are you good with that? Can you?
Yes, that's good. Cool.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. And so I'll ask you also as well, just a couple of things, just in terms of housekeeping. If you could just mute your screens when we're talking, Ronelle and I are going to lead the session. And if you could be kind enough just to mute your screen. Do come on screen, of course, but just mute your audio, just so we have the best sound quality as well. But please feel free to put in the chat function, of course, any questions that you have. I think one of the things that is very important for us, Ronelle and I, is to make sure that we cover the questions, the burning questions that you have. Okay, so please do that and raise those questions, and we'll have time for a Q&A at the end as well. So some of you know me quite well, and as you know, I've had sort of 25 years, I guess, in governance. And I guess one of the things that I would say is that the conversations that are taking place in boardrooms today relative to when I first started are very, very different. And I think that there's been an evolution around governance, and that evolution has really led us, I think, to where we are now. And so I'm very, very excited that the ISO 37000 has been created and has been is now part of the sort of governance ecosystem. And so with that sort of governance experience, one of the things I wanted to make sure was I stayed up to date with governance, governance evolution. And so the ISO, getting the opportunity to study the ISO and get certified in it was very, very important to me. And so Ronelle, my co-presenter, one person I have to say, just before I ask you to give a little introduction about yourself, Ronelle, Ronelle is a person I admire greatly, and I have to say, humbly, is one of the world's experts on ISO 37000. And so I don't say that lightly, Ronelle, but tell us a little bit about your background and experience.
Oh, thanks so much, Paul. I actually saw Paul and followed him, and then one day I kind of mustered up the courage and reached out to him on LinkedIn, and now we're collaborating. So it shows you sometimes, what did they say? Fortune favors the brave, or something like that. So it's absolutely wonderful being here. Yeah, it's absolutely wonderful being here. Yes, my name is Ronelle Klein. I am the CEO of the Fluid Rock Governance Group. We are the leading independent corporate governance firm. We're based in Johannesburg, South Africa. And it's maybe ironic, I find it a bit ironic, but we have Professor Mervyn King, who is from South Africa, and he is one of the names in corporate governance. And I think because he's from South Africa and because he's based here and he's set up a lot of, I don't know, institutes and, the King reports, it's almost as if he created an industry in South Africa, which we export. We export corporate governance. So that's very interesting. So, but it's very. I'm also been in boardrooms for about more than 10, 20 years. I don't know anymore. And like my colleague always says, we don't share what we know because we're lawyers, but because of the scars on our back. And that's what we we really do at Fluid Rock. We were the first to market with the ISO 37000 course, and it is accredited by APMG, so it is internationally accredited. But Paul, we can talk about that a bit more later. So back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ronelle. So let's move my slides on a little bit. This is primarily what we want to cover today. A little bit of intro to and history around, you know, where we've landed in terms of the sort of governance. We'll talk about the ISO wheel as well. Okay, what does that look like? And the governance conditions. Essentially, the ISO 37000 has created a set of conditions that suggest good governance. And one of the key aspects of the ISO 37000 as well is it's created a set of principles. Okay, this is a guidance-based document. This is not a prescriptive document in any way whatsoever. The ISO standard is about creating principles and guidance. And so we look at purpose, the primary principle. We also look at the foundational principles that support the primary purpose, and then the enabling principles around good governance. And what does that mean in terms of governance outcomes? We'll briefly look at that. And of course, importantly, why even adopt ISO 37000? Why can it be beneficial to you as an organization? And importantly, one of the things, unlike a number of ISO standards, if you like, that were created in the past, it's not the organization that becomes certified in the ISO 37000. It is the individual, okay? And that's why, of course, today, what we want to do is to help you understand the path to certification, okay? And of course, as we mentioned at the start, we'll have that opportunity to have some burning questions, Q&A session as well. So I'll try and keep looking at the chat as well, see what questions come up, and then between us, Ronelle and I will be able to cover those. So if we think about, you know, governance trends and evolution, well, of course, you know, the foundation of governance is that an organization, of course, must exist for a meaningful reason. They have a purpose, the ultimate value that they generate for stakeholders. And of course, governance provides that direction, that oversight, that accountability, so that organizations are clear about the goals and the parameters within which to achieve them. And of course, up until, I guess, quite recently in governance history, governance was used primarily to optimize financial benefit to the organization and its shareholders, that concept of shareholder primacy, okay? And so to some extent, self-interest was institutionalized. And towards the end of 22, I had the opportunity to attend a course that, or a talk that was given by Professor King around the fact that, you know, this type of approach for organizations is totally unsustainable. The 20th century approach of shareholder primacy really meant that organizations were ignoring sort of societal well-being and environmental systems. They were essentially abusing the systems from which they drew their resources. And of course, that also means that, you know, when you have a system of self-interest, it means that it breeds corruption, it breeds greed and other self-interested behavior. And when that occurs at the governing body and the management level, of course, that means that, well, we've seen so many governance scandals around the world. I mean, we can all think of, I'm sure, plenty of governance scandals, recent governance scandals, and it keeps going on as well. You know, this is the amazing thing. I was doing a talk the other day that around this, it's not necessarily just about having strong governance systems in place. It's also about behaviors ultimately that create the conditions for that type of, you know, that type of scandal occurring. And that's why I think one of the things for me is that it's so important that we are not only creating the right foundations for good governance in terms of the systems and the processes and the policies, and ISO certainly encourages that. But I think one of the key aspects as well of it is that it also really encourages a different mindset as well, different approach to governance generally. And I think that you know, when I was listening to Professor King to talk about how we need to change our approach and how we need to think about the environment from which we draw our resources, you know, that is a key fundamental thinking around the ISO 37000. So I for one am glad that, you know, organizations hopefully will look at things in a different way, consider the wider stakeholder group. And ISO really to me is the sort of pinnacle of all of that thinking, all of that evolution around governance thinking. And Ronelle, how did so from your perspective, you know, having seen it, having knowing, you know, Professor King, how did ISO 37000 come about? What's your perspective on this?
Thanks, Paul. So if you think about it, we haven't had, or we didn't have a universal language on corporate governance. The approach to corporate governance was very much left to each individual jurisdiction. Some countries do have corporate governance frameworks, some of them don't. It's very interesting when you read the list of countries that do have corporate governance codes that it includes even countries that I thought wouldn't really. And it's, you know, and the countries that you think or thought would have had it doesn't. Like Canada doesn't have a formal one that covers all companies. Spain doesn't have it. You know, so there was definitely a need for a governance code that would really span across the globe. If you think about it, a lot of non-profit companies who look for funding, they have to prove that they have good corporate governance in place, and some of them are not very big, and then they have to actually show that they comply with the code that the donor subscribes to. And it's very, very difficult for them to then always chop and change depending on the jurisdiction that they come from. Now you have a code which is the ISO 37 code, and like you said, it's not like ISO 9001 where you are certified. It's much more of a guidance document, and it will enable organizations, regardless of their size, where they are, whether they're a formalized company, whether it's a voluntary organization. In South Africa, you know, there are tribes that adopted, you know, medical aid funds. I mean, even your tennis club could adopt it because you adopt it in a way that is fit for purpose to you. So that's why we really, really like ISO 37000, because it spans, I would say, countries, languages, cultures. It is it's almost agnostic, legal agnostic. So regardless of your legal system, you can still apply it, because it's almost, I would say, it's almost logic. You know, if we as a group sat down, we probably would come up with the same kind of principles, because it's something that is human and that is philosophical, and that is something that we can aim for. You know, it's aspirational, but still very much you can apply it on a fit for purpose basis. So we were very keen to get it. I'm not a governance professional for governance sake. I'm really a person that wants to see every organization reach their strategic outcomes, and this absolutely fits with that, because it is about how do you structure your company, what must you have in place so that you can be successful. So it's very much that international language. And if you look at the number of countries that subscribe to it, or that approved it, it is astonishing, because how it happened was 77 countries cooperated in the drafting of ISO 37000, but it was tabled to all the members of ISO, which is I think it's 164 countries, and they all commented on it. So it's very much a product of a lot of very, very clever, diverse minds, and I think that's what makes it good. And I'm not saying it's always going to be applicable to every single organization in the strict sense, but in a general international scale, national scale, locally, regional, it is quite. I think it's quite a good document.
Yeah, thanks, Ronelle. I think you're right. It sort of crystallizes all of that thinking, and the fact that it's a universal language as well, that 164 countries can say, yes, this is what we aspire to. And of course, being a global standard, I think that it can also be very useful for multinational organizations, those that operate in different jurisdictions, because now suddenly you have a standard, if you like, a consistent standard across all of those jurisdictions in which an organization may operate. And as you mentioned, I think the beauty of it is that it provides for organizations that previously didn't really have a governance framework, or didn't even have some guidance to work on in order to create that governance framework, whatever that looks like, as you mentioned, the tennis club or the not-for-profit and so on. Often around the world, the governance codes of guidance tend to focus on listed and issuer companies and not necessarily on smaller entities. But of course, all of this is about being able to interpret it in the way that suits you, because every organization, of course, requires a degree of leadership. In order to be sustainable in the long term, you need to have ethical and effective governance. Okay, and most organizations will have a governing body of some type or other. Okay, whether that governing body consists of a single individual or a few dozen people. It's the governing body that is really, I think, the custodian of the organization's sort of governance, making sure that you've got that ethical and that effective governance in place. And I think that you highlighted, Ronelle, the fact that this is so much global in nature. And so what we're really talking about here is the world's consensus view on what ethical and effective governance actually incorporates. Okay, and so this is applicable just to so many people really, and so many organizations and types of professionals. It provides guidance, of course, the governing bodies, because if you look at the ISO standard, it's written on the basis that the governing body should, and so on and so forth. It's all about looking at the governing body as the cornerstone of good governance. But again, it's not prescriptive, and I think that's important to recognize. It's about, principles and guidance. You should do this, and rather than must do this. And that gives you latitude to use the standard and apply it in the way that suits you best. But I think one thing that we should recognize as well is that it's about also integrating governance through the organization. We'll talk about that as I come to another slide, but it's not just about the governing body as such, although they do lead from the front. Okay, it's about how governance can be integrated right throughout the organization. So let's look at the what we call the I guess we call this, Ronelle, don't we, the ISO wheel? Would that be the best description of this? And
Yes, I used to call it the circle, but I like your wheel. It works.
right, okay, the circle is good as well. I think, but it's all, it's all interrelated, and I think that's the key thing here. So what you'll see here, of course, is on this wheel circle is that very much at the center of the wheel or the graphic is purpose. The primary principle is of any organization is purpose. Why do we exist? How do we serve our clients? And then we look at the foundational, how do you generate value? How do you strategize? How do you create your strategy? How are you accountable as well? We talked about the concept of stakeholder governance, which is where we've arrived at now. As an organization, you need to be accountable to a whole range of stakeholders, people that are affected by the activities of the organization. Okay, and of course, oversight. What the board, the governing body, exercises oversight. That's a key principle, and so much of that is focused, those foundational principles are focused on the board and how it operates. And then we have the enabling principles, making sure that we do engage with our stakeholders. And that doesn't just mean about being inclusive, it means actually really engaging and talking to them and ensuring that their interests are considered when we are making decisions. Okay, that's a critical part. That is really so much of the evolution and what Professor King talked about, that we need to adopt a wider view about our impact on on our stakeholders and consider them. And of course, leadership. How important is leadership to any organisation? Making sure as well that if you think about data and decisions, you need the right data to make good decisions. Okay, you need to ensure that you're governing risk so that as an organisation you can manage those, and that any work you do, any decisions that you make, your strategy is within the risk appetite of the organisation. Social responsibility, I think, is a key part as well. And I think, again, this speaks to the evolution of organizations, why it's so important to consider that you are a part of the ecosystem. Okay. And to me, you know, making sure that we understand our responsibility to the wider environment is a key component of how organizations should operate from a ethical points of view. And of course, ESG is so much, the S in ESG is so much about that. And of course, as an organization, you know, you need to be viable and perform over time. In other words, that you're not stripping the environment of its assets in order to make profits today at the expense of you know, future generations. You need to have an organization that can draw resources, but also leave resources for the next generation. And so if we think about the governance conditions, then this is one of the key areas, I think, around you know, the sort of basis, if you like, creating the right conditions for good governance. It needs to be integrated across the organisation. So in other words, it's not just exercised by the governing body, but it's right throughout the organisation, including stakeholders, managers, other sort of internal functions of the organisation. And when I talk about stakeholders there, that's sort of member stakeholders, people that, like employees, that are directly affected by the operations of the organisation. And of course, making sure that we integrate this governance in a sort of concurrent manner. In other words, that we do all these things at the same time and all together. So in other words, when you think about the principles that you apply, you're not just applying one in isolation. You're essentially creating a governance framework that should be that should really apply all of the principles. I think you know, you don't just say, I'm going to look at purpose, and then I'm going to look at stakeholder governance and strategy and so on. This is something that is you're working at it all in at one time. And also it should be integrated, even though the governing body are taking leadership on good governance, it's about integrating it right through the organization, so that the type of you know, mindset and decisions that take place are consistent through the organization. And that means, of course, making sure that we have effective delegation. Okay, the governing body can delegate, but still remains accountable for what's being delegated. We look at governance and management activities as well. And often I get speaking to people complaining that there's not a clear line between what is governance and what is management activities. And one of the key principles here is to ensure that there is a clear distinction between what is governance, the governing body's oversight function, strategic activities, and what are the sort of management activities and more operational day-to-day activities. And of course, ensuring that sustainability is considered in the decision making. So in other words, again, we are satisfying the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own words as well. And one of the things that when we look at sustainability, one of the references in the standard to sustainability is to the sorry, just got a call there, just bear with me a second, just come on that. Yeah, is the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, that's a key, and some of you will have be quite familiar with that. Also, of course, as you mentioned, stakeholder expectations should be considered in decision making. This means again that we are understanding the needs of our stakeholders, that we are essentially a sort of good corporate citizen on all of this. Any other further comments, Ronelle, on the sort of governance conditions?
Sorry, rookie error, talking with on mute. Yeah, I
Yeah, sure.
always say that, you know, without these elements in place, you will never ever reach a success or your governance outcomes on a sustainable way. So if you don't have an integrated way of looking at your business and you have a silo approach, or you see, for example, your any of your stakeholders as outside the organization, even though they're outside of the organization, I mean removed from the organization, then I don't think this is going to result in a sustainable organization over time. So being an integrated or having integrated thinking is very, very important. And one of the things ISO says is that all of these things should be applied concurrently. So the 11 principles and ensuring that you have the governance conditions in place is very, very important for you to make sure that you have a sustainable organization that can actually stand the test of time and the you know, everything that nature, the world, pandemics, you know, the economy, anything that can throw at you, you will need this in place. So this is why this is so important.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Ronelle. Yeah, I mean we're getting more and more shocks to the system, of course, aren't we? And it means that as organisations, we need to be more resilient and able to withstand those systemic shocks. And COVID was a great example of that. But we're also facing, you know, climate change. We need to strategise on the basis of these things happening. And therefore, having a solid foundation of good governance right through the organisation is so critical. And that's why ISO gives you that guidance on that. So thinking about the governing body as well, you know, the standard talks about the composition and the structure of the governing body. And whilst it recognises that, of course, it will vary between organisations, it recommends, of course, that governing bodies are suitably competent with the relevant knowledge and understanding, skills and experience, and of course to be diverse, cognitively diverse, as well as, you know, often in its sort of composition, that they're independent in their thoughts and action, and they can exercise the appropriate time commitment and the capacity that they bring to the role. So I think these are key sort of principles that are really reasonably well understood, but I think being brought together into the document is very, very important to recognise that these are things that are absolutely critical. It also talks about the appropriate probity and the ethical compass as well within the governing body. And to me, I think that's so important, because it is about the mindset. It's about approaching it with the right mindset. I think that one of the things I've seen working with organisations when they're looking for new directors, for example, they'll look at the track record, they'll look at their you know, their leadership and what they've done and their technical ability. But often what tends to fall to the wayside a little bit is actually the behaviours and the you know, their whole moral compass, you say, that sort of ethical thinking. And that, I think, the behaviours is often what creates the conditions for you know, poor behaviours create the conditions for scandals and governance scandals and you know, of the type that we've sort of seen. Do you agree with that, Ronelle? I mean, why do you think the ISO focuses so much on the role of the governing body?
The governing body, I mean, and they use the word governing body just to signify any group that takes a leadership for an organization, even though it's not a formalized organization. So I'm just going to use the word board instead of governing body, which is actually just means the same for our purposes today. It is that if you have the right people in the room will who have the right experience, skills, knowledge, which means they are competent, that actually sets the direction of the organization. A board can oftentimes actually distract management from executing the strategy, or not make the strategy clear, or disrupt it. I know boards where if they just never met, the company would do better, you know. But also the reason why ISO focuses so much on the governing body and the board is because there's so much written about management already. And a lot of people take board positions without really knowing what it entails and what their job is. What am I here to do? Why am I here? What is my role? And not everybody, most people, let's just just take a glass half full approach. Most directors want to do the right thing, and sometimes they're so overeager that they actually disrupt the board. If you're a non-executive but you are an executive in your day-to-day job, it's very difficult for you to be a non-executive director. You might interfere. So why ISO focuses so much on the governing body is to say, let's have the right people in the room with the right experience, the right skills, so that they really can take this business to another place. If you think of some companies that's become irrelevant, I think it's they didn't have the right people in the boardroom. There are companies that believe the cell phone was just a passing fad. You can have many such examples. So what you need is, if you have the right people in the room, they will help you to set the right strategy, and they are able to help management. They're not just there to test. It's also there to be their brains trust and to help implement. And when the CEO struggles, is to be there, because the role of a CEO is very lonely. Who do you bounce with? Who is the person that you can call for advice and guidance? It should be your board. And if you're a non-executive director on a board, will the executive call you for advice, or are you disruptive? So that's very, very important. The structure of your board, the size. Does it make sense for the organization that you're in? Is it sluggish? Are people overboarded? Are they underboarded? Let's say they don't have enough experience. I have directors that have been nominated to other listed entities because they were on the first entity, and at the very first entity, they weren't doing such a great job. So it's almost like once you're in the wash, you get appointed more. And then hopefully in time, you get the experience, because oftentimes we all have to fake it until we make it, and we get an opportunity, and then you have to grow into that opportunity. So that's also fair enough. But really, the governing body is responsible for the governance of the organization, and they have to make sure that the organization reach its outcomes and the governance outcomes. That's why there's such a strong focus on the governing body. And what's also very interesting is that in ISO, it discerns. It says a governing body is a human-based system. And management can include a digital-based system. So it allowed for management to maybe include AI or technology, but it says, when we come to the governing body, we're a bunch of people who have to do the right things. And like you said, the right behaviors, the right competence, the right composition, the right structure. And if I can just add in closing to this point, is to say that what was right yesterday might not be right today. That's why it's so important to always just regularly being, appropriate to the organization, review the governance structure of the organization, because you might find that at some point in time, a certain committee structure works for you, and then it becomes, irrelevant, and then you can actually do away with it, or the other way around. So reviewing your structure, your composition, the skills that you need is very important, and also choosing the right people for your board is important. A lot of times, so sorry, I said I'm closing, and here I go again. I'm really closing now. So a lot of times it's, who do we know who can be on our board? So it's a little bit of it becomes a little bit incestuous at times. So it's important also to go wide, because having people on your board that have different voices, have a different way of thinking, that are different to you, look different to you, all of that stuff, different ages, whatever, is so refreshing, and really can mean the difference between an organization that is maybe poorly performing or just performing well and great. It could be that different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I think that the great points. Thanks, Ronelle. And certainly the empirical evidence suggests that diverse boards do perform better over time. And, again, going back to the whole competence side of things and the evolution of the board, you need to make sure that you stay up to date, because when you get those governance failures or scandals, or when an organization does fail, I mean, you know, you look at Blockbuster and you know, other organizations that just didn't see what was coming down the tracks, and often the question that gets asked is, where was the board? You know, on these, did the board ask the right questions? Were they you know, sufficiently understanding the situations? I remember actually in the seminar I was talking about the Theranos scandal, which was Elizabeth Holmes and so on, and the composition of the board was designed to get government connections, not to actually provide that degree of oversight that is really required of a fully functioning board. And so much of the emphasis is on the governing body, and I think that is absolutely right. Let's have a look at the principles first of all. The primary one, of course, being purpose. And just in the interest of time, we just want to really just skirt over these very briefly, just to give you a bit of a flavour, I guess, as to what is in the standard and what you could expect to learn and do a deeper dive around it. The primary principle being purpose. What do we understand by purpose within the context of ISO 37000, Ronelle? Why is it the primary principle, would you say?
So according to ISO, purpose is the primary principle because everything you do is based around your purpose. Why do your team members get up in the morning? To come and give their effort. You know, why do your customers, your clients support you? Why do you, you know, why do you do what you do? When you are having an ethical conundrum, you measure your decision against your purpose. Is it furthering my purpose? You know, so the purpose is such a strong principle, and it really resonates with I would say a lot of the younger generations, because they don't want to wake up to only make money. You know, it seems like a life wasted to some of these people. And it's not just the younger guys; it's they actually saying out loud with that what some of the older generations probably are thinking. But it is, if I'm going to align myself to an organization, whether I'm an employee or a client, why? You know, and this is why it's so important. And it's what's very interesting is ISO says when you set your purpose, you must also understand where you come from. You know, what is your history? Why were you set up? What was your founders? If you're not the founder, what was your reason for being? And why are you in this world, and how do you make it a better place? And if you think about it, it is you as an organization, you in your community, and you in the world. You know, we all have ripple effects, and you know, well, ripple effects on each other, and as organizations, so much more. So it is if I can just read from the principle, it says the pursuit of purpose is at the center of all organization and of primary importance for the governance of the organization. So the governing body will use the purpose of the organization to actually govern everything they do, every investment decision, every decision of resource allocation, budget approval, strategy approval against that. And because all of that must speak to the same point. And I see there's a question about value generation, which we'll answer just now, because all of that ties into your purpose.
Yeah, thank you. And it also, I think it certainly does. And I think also with purpose, what that flows purpose is the values of the organization, the mission, the vision, you know, where are we going? And I think one of the things as well that is often underrated when we have a clear purpose is that we create the right culture. Again, the right the culture throughout the organization is integrated throughout the organization. And so that creates a culture of engagement where people see a bigger picture. One of the problems I always found working in large corporations and banks, for example, was that you mentioned earlier, Ronelle, about being siloed in your viewpoint. And that was often the case with organizations that I worked for. And this is about seeing the bigger picture. And so it's very important for purpose to be communicated through the organization so that people can be engaged and understand, you know, the bigger picture of the work that they do. And I think that, you know, generationally, that is an expectation of the millennials and Gen Z. They want to be working for organizations that they see aligns with their values, and you know, that they see the bigger picture, the bigger purpose. And so I like to do that. We talked about briefly value generation and strategy, oversight, accountability. I'll just sort of briefly mention these just in terms of what the principle or what the standard says about these. First of all, value generation. The governing body should define the organisation's value generation objectives such that they fulfil the organisational purpose in accordance with the organisational values and the natural environment, the social and economic context within which it operates. So in other words, we're creating value within that ecosystem and being aligned with purpose. The strategy, the governing body should direct and engage with the organisational strategy in accordance with the value generation model to fulfill the organisational purpose. So again, that all ties back to purpose. Oversight, the principle is that the governing body should oversee the organisation's performance to ensure that it meets the governing body's intentions for and expectations of the organisation, its ethical behaviour and its compliance obligations. So it gives a sort of overview of you know, the where the board should direct its oversight attention. And accountability, the governing body should demonstrate its accountability to the organisation as a whole and hold to account those to whom it is delegated. Okay, so accountability is essentially a two-way street. Then we look at the enabling governing principles as well. And again, this is really they're not core governance activities, but they are core enablers of those activities. And so these 6 governance principles are essentially representative of what internationally is expected of governing bodies in the 21st century. So again, if we think about stakeholder engagement, the governing body should ensure that the organization's stakeholders are appropriately engaged and their expectations considered. Leadership, the governing body, and again, this all ties back to the governing body, should lead the organisation ethically and effectively and ensure that such leadership throughout the organisation. Data and decisions, the governing body should recognise data as a valuable resource for decision making by the governing body, the organisation and others. And in the standard, there's a lot about data security. And we recognise now that organisations are very much data driven, that we need to use and protect the data that we have in order to facilitate good decision making. And of course, risk governance, the governing body should ensure that it considers the effect of uncertainty on the organisational purpose and the associated strategic outcomes. Social responsibility, the governing body should ensure that decisions are transparent and aligned with broader societal expectations. So again, it's about being a good corporate citizen. Viability and performance over time. The governing body should ensure that the organisation remains viable, performs over time, without compromising the ability of current and future generations to meet their needs. Okay, so these are really the principles as described in the standard, and it's just that overarching aspect of how to create a governance framework that will include all of those principles. So then, what does that result in? Governance outcomes, essentially. These are the governance outcomes that are described in ISO 37000. So, Ronelle, what do the governance outcomes mean in practice for an organisation? How can we interpret and apply them, do you think?
What's very interesting, Paul, is that the ISO standard doesn't say a lot about the outcomes. So every organization can really craft what this means for them. But there are some guidelines. Effective performance means, the word effective means you are successful in reaching the outcomes that you have set for yourself. So this is where you will measure your success in creating value in terms of the 6 capitals, including financial. A lot of people think that that when we talk about governance, we actually don't want to pay out to our shareholders. We do. They're a very important stakeholder. but it also means that we've created value for our employees in terms of our IP, etc. So ethical behavior, of course, it means that that ethical compass runs throughout the organization, and they will know when they can do something or not do something. So it's a culture, like you said, that has been established. And then responsible stewardship, it means that the board, because go back to the governing body, has established responsible stewardship over the whole organization. So meaning that management is a responsible system, and humans, because it's both. And and I call it the fruit of the tree. I think if you want to reach the fruit of the tree, you need to do everything else right so that you can get there, and then you can decide what this means. But what is also interesting is that how we give KPIs to our management and our CEO. Your board should actually have KPIs, and it should be determined in terms of the governance outcomes and what that looks like. It can be very, very clear. So this is really a brilliant set of outcomes, and the fact that they've left it vague. Initially, I thought that they just didn't finish writing. I was as if they ran out of time. But then we started, having conversation about it, and they actually left it up to the organization to define it for them.
Yeah, I think that's the important thing. It gives that flexibility to interpret. All of this is about how you interpret it and apply it to your organization. But obviously, these governance outcomes, in a broader sense, are really what we should be aspiring to.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, well, from your experience then, Ronelle, can you give an example of where an organization has applied ISO 37000 and the benefits that they achieve from doing so?
Yes. One thing I have to say is that it is a journey. It's not as if you're going to apply it and then we're done and then we're finished. It's a continuous journey, and every organization crafts its own governance journey. It's not a comparable journey. It is something that you set for yourself. So the one example that I can think of is we helped or helping a company in Norway. They're a logistics company with about 50,000 people all across the world, and they started implementing ISO, but they decided to first do it at a head office level, so that they all had the same language, a shared language, a shared idea, and what it would mean for them. So they started putting it in their policies, and then having workshops, and then it's that behavior that you speak about. And then about the board, about how the board measures these things. So it's a journey, and it will continue. There's a company in Uganda that used ISO to determine the competency framework for their boards. Okay, it's a holding entity and the subsidiaries. So it's got many, many different use cases. And that's what's so nice about it that I like. It is, forget the fact that it's an ISO standard. It's just a set of rules that helps us structure ourselves in a certain way. And that's really it.
I think that's really key to it, isn't it? Really, it's a set of rules in one place. It's a framework that you can refer to and say, yes, this can be used and interpreted for my organization in this way. It's that sort of international language, if you like, isn't it, for good governance? And I think that the point you raised as well, it ensures as well that organizations have that opportunity to create better investment opportunities for themselves. They can attract better talent. They can, create confidence in the stakeholders that they work with. And of course, we also talked about the shocks to the system as well that inevitably we face as organizations. And so I think that creating a degree of, should we say, resilience, that improved organizational resilience, these are all areas, I think, which can be hugely beneficial to an organization. There's no limit, I think, is there, to how it can be interpreted and used for a specific organization. So any other benefits do you think, Ronelle, that can think of this?
Yes, actually, if I can use if Hukam's question, he says, "Hi Paul, Hukam here from Dubai. Thanks for the session. Your quick take on executive directors performing governance role. Do you think a board with both executive and non-executive directors is preferred over only non-executive board? And does ISO recommend anything specific on this?" So I want to just use your question. I did three projects in Dubai on assessing government organizations and their governance structures, which is very, very interesting. Because in Dubai they have, it's not formally called that, but they more have a dual board system. And what was very interesting is how ISO was applied there, because they said they're fully compliant with ISO, which means it's not completely right because you can't comply to ISO. It's a guidance standard. You apply ISO. And it's very interesting because, for example, and just moving away a little bit from Dubai, is that in many state-owned organizations, they have what we would say only non-executive directors on the board, or if it's a dual system, they have almost an executive board, and then the executive authority has the oversight. So ISO doesn't necessarily speak about that, but it does speak about what these forums have to achieve, and I think that is very, very, very good. And one of the things it is about oversight. So you need to decide for yourself, do you have independent oversight? And this is, for example, where I think Dubai needs a corporate governance code for all organizations, not just listed organizations, because it has one for listed. Because in those country codes, it should talk about independent, non-executive directors and executive directors. But if you ask me personally on that question, and actually the question is for you, Paul, so you must also give your input. But if you what you want is a good mix. You want a mix of executives, a mix of non-executives, and a mix of independent non-executive directors, because that brings that oversight. But ISO is it leaves it to you to decide.
Yeah,
what do you think, Paul, there?
I would agree with you, Ronella. I think that you do need the independent non-executive directors. They bring that business acumen and expertise and experience from that they've seen in other organizations, what works well and what doesn't. And I think one of the key things I've always found that sitting in board meetings with non-executive directors is that they're not afraid to ask the hard questions as well, to challenge management and to bring some rigor around the process. And so again, it comes down to understanding the oversight versus a management role and respecting that distinction between the two and that separation of roles, and really recognizing, from a management perspective, how much value a good, competent and independent thinking board can actually bring to good decision making. So and certainly the ISO encourages that, but it also is so open to you as well. It enables you to interpret it in the way that you think best, that governance structure. And so so many benefits to adopting ISO, but of course ultimately it's often will come down to the individual governance, chief governance officer, the corporate secretary, someone that is working closely with the board to drive the process. And this is where the ISO certification can be so beneficial to you as governance professionals to get certified and to have the knowledge and the skills and the tools to be able to use the standard and interpret it in a way that suits your organization and ultimately bring it to your organization. So Ronelle, can you perhaps just briefly describe the process of certification, why we should do it, and how we can achieve that certified status?
So it is the course. That's an online course, and what we have done as FluidRock is Paul has the license to present the course also on a face-to-face basis or hybrid. And then there's an exam, which is not very difficult, but it's very word tricky. And then you get the certification, and I see you've got yours on screen, Paul. Well done. And it is APMG is the accreditation body. FluidRock is the body that has the license to the course. We actually compiled it with Candor Governance, and Carolyn Chalmers, who is the facilitator, she was actually on the committee. She played a very important role in the committee to get ISO through. And then it is Professor King's almost NPO, the Good Governance Academy, has endorsed the course. So if I can also then just quickly pop to Dan's question, he said, will it become regulated or strongly suggested? We believe that it will not become regulated because it's a guidance standard. However, what we have seen is that a lot of directors who do this, they get, you know, I don't know if it was just a luck or whatever, but the guys on the course were actually then, they got more directorships because they have it. So it's a bit more of a competitive advantage. And I think for the governance professionals, it is about keeping up to the, you know, up to date. For the ESG guys, it's very, very important because G is obviously sometimes a neglected issue. They think if you've got a board and an audit committee, you've got good governance. Not at all. It goes very deep into the organization. So, and also if you're into private equity or an analyst, I think sometimes the governance elements in an organization is neglected, or it is become scripted or tick boxing, which we don't want. So I think it is just, you know, for me personally, it's given a lot of depth to my career. You know, we do a lot of advisory work, a lot of strategy work around corporate governance for clients, and it just helps. It also gives structure. And sometimes we just don't tell people that we're actually helping with ISO 37000. It just makes sense. So Paul, for me, in my personal opinion, it's added a lot of value to my career, and I've seen some others as well.
Well, yeah, I would totally endorse that, because I think for me as well, it's when I've been speaking to boards and just doing some of that advisory work, it just adds so much more depth and framework to those discussions. And I think that if you're aspiring within your organization to be, should we say, a trusted board advisor, to work with the board knowledgeably and to advise them on governance issues, this is the cutting edge in governance thinking. I think all of the governance frameworks and guides and codes have been incorporated and codified into one document that can really help you to crystallize so much of the thinking around governance within your organization. So I would agree that, you know, whilst we could say it's a career boost, and it certainly is, it's also a knowledge boost as well. I think that's very, very important to understand as well, that you're acquiring so much knowledge from what is a relatively small time and you know, financial investment as well. I know that we have people from around the world, of course, which is fantastic. I'm so glad that, you know, you've all joined us. But just from the Canadian perspective, because I have had a number of inquiries from colleagues I know about the cost of certification in Canada, and so Fluid Rock offers two options. The first one is the digital option, which is essentially providing all of the materials, the case studies, the questions, the videos from Carolyn Chalmers, and practice questions that give you all of the materials that you need to understand and apply the standard in order for you to be able to you know, hopefully pass the exam, the APMG exam, which I think you mentioned earlier, Ronelle, is sort of 1 hour exam, but a little bit tricky interpreting the standard as well, but eminently doable. I was fortunate enough to attend the live online training, which Ronelle actually ran, and it was fantastic because it really helped, I think, for me to crystallize exactly how the standard worked in practice with lots of those good examples. And it's also a great opportunity to speak to other governance practitioners as well, and to understand where they were coming from. So there are two options. The digital one is at 910 Canadian dollars, and the hybrid, the digital and the live online training, is $1,200, and that's something I would certainly recommend, that you get so much benefit from the live online training. And the cost of the standard, I think, is running at around, it's available from yourselves, isn't it, Ronelle, through your contacts in South Africa, around 60 Canadian dollars or so. You need to have the standard in order to be able to do the exam. So yeah, that's really it. Certainly, if any of you are interested in looking further into the ISO certification and taking it, please drop me an email, or put in the chat function that you're interested, and I can send you a booking form via email later on today or tomorrow. And so we just have a little bit of time just for some final sort of questions, I think. I was just looking at the chat function. Let me come out of sharing my screen, and we shall go through those questions. Let's have a look. Find my chat function. Here we go. So I know that a number of them you'd already covered, Renelle, which is wonderful as we went along. And so keep any other questions coming. Do you think, here's one, do you think that when we put our values, it should be related to the ethics? Okay, so I guess when we're considering a value system, how closely related is that to our ethical standards of governance? What are your thoughts, Renelle?
So it's a great question. So the way I structure it for myself is that you have your organizational purpose, you have your North Star, you have your values and your value generation model. And there's another question a little bit further down about what is a value generation model. Now, your value generation model is to say, how are you going to create value for your 6 capitals, which is your, I'm not going to mention all of them, but you know, your people, your stakeholders, your IP, manufacturing, all of them. How do you create value? Which means what kind of organization are you? Are you an organization that's going to create value? Because the environment is also one of your stakeholders, or are you going to take value? Are you going to destroy value? And what makes you really think is, and you have to do this in light of your purpose, is to say, for me to reach my purpose, how am I going to create value for everyone? And that is very, very important. Now, and you do that based on your values. So, for example, ours are open, honest communication, trust, integrity, and unity. And we link all of this the whole time. So you create a system where your people know exactly what ethical behaviors are, because ethical behaviors is an outcome, which means if you do everything right. So in my mind, if I can go through them, it is purpose, values, value generation model. You set your strategy, you set your strategic pillars, you do your balanced scorecards, whichever system you believe in, your implementation plans, and all of that. And then through all of that, you bring in all the 11 principles to reach your outcomes, and you kind of describe what an ideal situation for you would be and what those outcomes would look like. So it's all ingrained, and that's what we mean by an integrated system. So if you have a purpose-driven organization with a proper value system, a proper value generation model, you definitely need to be an ethical business at the end. So those are all interlinked and intertwined, and that's what makes it so beautiful, is that it becomes a system and a language. And this is why it's important that the whole business eventually speaks this language, even though they don't have to know that they're speaking ISO, but that it is a language and the shared words that you would have in your organization. So definitely those are linked, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Renelle. Yeah, absolutely. So we're at the top of the hour, but we have a few other questions. So if you know, anyone would like to drop off, no problem at all. But there's some great questions here, so I'd like to maybe just address some of these. There's another one that I thought was really interesting. What is the best approach to introduce, implement, and manage governance in a startup business? And so I thought I would cover this because that's a really interesting one for me, because I've worked recently with a startup, and I think one of the things that often the mindset around a startup is that it's about getting your product out there as quickly as possible, getting scale and getting profits ultimately. But you're not going to build a house without foundations and just hope that you know, as you build brick by brick, that you hope it's all going to come together in one place. In the same way, when you create, when you're developing a new business, you need to have the foundations in place. And I think that the governance structure, having the right approaches, the principles, and the right structure, reporting structure, having perhaps an advisory board can be very, very useful for a startup. Making sure that you don't ignore those governance issues, because ultimately that can affect you later down the line when perhaps your ability to expand beyond you know, your initial growth can be somewhat constrained by the decisions that you made at the outset. So I think having a strong and solid governance structure right from the outset provides those sort of conditions for you to grow, but to grow sustainably as well. So yeah, let's have a look. I think actually we covered, you covered the aspect, Renelle, around regulation. And yeah, well, I certainly don't expect that we will have ISO as a regulated provision in the future. Another question, who is responsible for an organization's governance, the board or management? Well, I think we can say that primarily the ISO is aimed at the governing body, but of course, with the whole integrated governance, it becomes then the responsibility right through the organization. But I think we perhaps agree, Ronelle, what do you think? That accountability rests with the governing body.
Yes, and ISO speaks about that extensively, about how you can delegate a portion of your accountability, but you keep full accountability and responsibility, and how it trickles down and cascades into the organization, and it goes in detail into what does delegation mean. It says specifically that it's not like the old way of I given a command and you listen, or you given a command and I listen. That demand and control economy is gone. They talk about a swarm system, about the swarm must know where you're going and then they will get you there, but you need to enable your people. So it's very much like a strategy. It's the board is responsible, takes accountability for it, but the management must execute it. So management has to set policies, implement and report back on how they've implemented governance in the business so that you reach your governance outcomes.
Absolutely, but it's not that command or control leadership that we've seen before. It is about creating the right conditions through delegation to enable people to work with a degree of autonomy, but ultimately the board is accountable. Dan said, how long does it take to complete the course on average? And so from my own perspective, I would say that it was probably around 25 hours, if you like, of man hours of study with everything, reading the manual and to listen to the videos, do the practice questions, do the exam itself. Is that a fair guide, do you think, Ronelle? I don't know whether I'm too studious or not studious enough.
I'm not going to answer. I think you're just a brilliant brain. But I think if I say to people, like you say, about 25 hours, so I call it a week, but not like a full week. So it's not as special. It's not a very long code. You know, the ISO standard is not a very long standard. The manual that we add to it is about 100 pages. So it really just explains. And then the videos is about an hour in total, but you've got to think about it. So it's about these short snippets of video with multiple choice questions. So I think about 25 hours is a good way. I always say to people, do all the work, go through all the manuals, all the videos, then read the ISO standard twice, and then you go right, because it's an open book. So you print the book, which doesn't make sense because we shouldn't print, but you're not allowed to have any other screens with you because it's an invigilated course online. So I think that should be about right. But it's really a pithy, to the point, sharp, short, sharp course.
I think the one thing as well I would say is that you really only start learning when you start to apply it as well. I mean, you're learning, of course, but you really get that deep knowledge when you say, how does this apply to my organization? That's why it's so beneficial to have this, because you've now got a toolkit that you can study and apply to your organization. I think that the benefits far outweigh the investment in doing the course. Perhaps I'll make this a final question, just because thank you everyone for staying beyond the hour. Really appreciate. To me that suggests the level of interest, and I'm so glad to see that. But Neil said, with so many codes around governance, what is unique about ISO 37000 that is not already in existing codes? And is there any regulatory endorsement on it? So, North America adoption. So I guess the question really firstly is, well, what does ISO 37000 bring that other codes don't? What do you think to that, Renee?
Well, I think there are so many codes, and it's really frustrating, actually. And then, especially if your organization has applied a specific code. But if I can say, if you have an in-country code, ISO is more like an umbrella, and your in-country code is the handle of the umbrella. And it links you to other jurisdictions. So it's very specifically applicable to, like you mentioned, also multinationals, which can then apply it into all jurisdictions where they operate, while they're applying the in-country codes. Now, some countries don't have in-country codes, but the US and North America definitely have approved it because it's one of the membership countries of ISO. But if there's a regulatory move behind it, I don't think so. And that's not what we want. You know, if you look at SOX, it costs so much money to implement. So we want a guidance code so that it can be applied and fit for purpose. The startup question, you can read it and apply it to you. The listed question, you can read it and apply it to you. You know, it really doesn't matter. We have a voluntary organization with 12,000 people. They're applying it because it's finally giving them some structure. So I think it's horses for courses. It's maybe not, maybe you read through it and decide we already have another code and we're comfortable with it. Absolutely. If you don't have stakeholder that's abroad and it's more concentrated and they all understand your code, then I would always apply fit for purpose governance. But maybe if you want to go through it, there's something that you think, oh, this is interesting. We should look at this for maybe let's say data and decisions, because data is a thing that decisions are made on the basis of data. Is my data sound? You know, by boards. So it's a very interesting angle. So I'm not saying that this is the be all and end all. I'm saying that in absence of anything else, this is great. And if you do have something else, like we have King, and because a lot of people who wrote King are also on ISO, there's a lot of similarities. It has a different angle. It has a different approach. And like I said, it is agnostic, everything agnostic, legal agnostic, compliance agnostic, and you can apply it. So I would say that if you are applying other codes already, it will be easier to implement, especially if it's guidance codes and not legislative. It will be easier and it will have a lot of value. But I would say, you know, get the ISO standard and have a read of it and see if it's applicable to you, and then make that decision, because horses for courses.
Yeah, and I think the beauty of it is the fact that it isn't prescriptive, that it can be applied in a way that, you know, we understand that there is no one size fits all governance, and this gives the tools for you to be able to apply governance in a way that suits your organization the best. And that's why, you know, regulating something like this, I think, would undermine the value that it actually brings. And so yeah, that's some great questions. And again, thank you everyone for just staying beyond the hour. I really appreciate everyone's interest today. And of course, I want to say a big thank you to you, Ronel, as well, for you know, around tea time in South Africa and joining us and giving the benefit of your insight and wisdom on this, because, you know, it's such an important development in governance generally, and so it's important that we all understand how it can benefit our organizations. And so just again, a reminder that please, you know, drop me a line if you want to, just in closing, if you're interested in finding out more, to sign up for the sessions, just put in the chat, drop me a line, and feel free to come back to us with any further questions that you have as well. And again, thank you, Ronel. Final thoughts.
Thanks so much to you and for everyone, and the great questions. It's wonderful.
Okay, thanks everyone. See you all soon, and thanks again for attending.